Everybody, thanks for joining. Just give us a few minutes. We'll let folks roll in. I'll get started about 3 or 4 minutes past. Hey everybody, thanks for joining. Just a reminder to folks that are still trickling in, so about 1 or 2 more minutes. While we wait to get started, for folks that are here, I'm going to throw a few links in the chat for you ahead of time. First one is for next month's webinar. So just a reminder, you can, while you're sitting and waiting, you can sign up. It's on December 14th. I'll give more of an overview at the end of this event, but December 14th, we'll be talking about sustainability and data-driven solutions to improve your operation. We've got the co-founder of the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition and a colleague from Omega Equipment Supply that is a multinational kitchen, restaurant, supply, and design build firm. So really looking forward to that. And then one of our guests that you'll learn more about, if you're not already aware, Andrew Kline and his firm Perkins Coie. I'll put a link in there to his bio and information. I think you'll highly recommend you guys check out Andrew and his firm if you haven't already. So a couple links there, and it's like maybe it's about time to get started. Let's see here. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. This is our 5th episode of When Things Go Wrong. Just a couple of housekeeping items. One, please keep your microphones muted. Definitely want to encourage questions and engagement. This webinar, just as in all of our previous webinars, are really here for you guys. So use the chat function, ask questions, share your thoughts. I'll do my best to address your questions throughout, but I think we've got a pretty jam-packed event today with a lot of good discussion points. So likely that we'll at least save the last 5 or 10 minutes for unanswered questions at the end. With that said, I want to just throw a brief poll out there to kick off, and then we'll introduce our speakers. So yeah, just a couple of quick questions. Seeing where you fall in the industry, make sure we're really speaking to the audience here. You cultivator, extractor, processor, or manufacturer of infused products, as we call it in Colorado and other locations, distributor, retailer, ancillary, or other. And then definitely curious to see your perspectives. I think part of the exciting item I'd like to see at the end is if anybody's perspectives on cannabis being rescheduled versus descheduled changes. And as you've answered the questions, thank you, everybody. Yeah, we're talking about rescheduling for the question, not descheduling, which we'll dive into the fun differences of that today and so much more. So I'll give you folks about another 10 seconds to answer the poll if you have not already. Going once, going twice. All right, got another person in. There we go, right in the nick of time. All right, poll is ending. Thank you, everybody. So looks like we've got a good mix of a lot of ancillary providers, a little more than half. Thank you. And then a few extractor processors. So, and I realize that some folks might even be in a vertical operation. So I can see you being like, well, which one? I'm both, but you only gave me one option. So thank you either way for putting your answer in there. And looks like we're, yeah, we're kind of all over the board here, mixed with your perspective on whether cannabis is rescheduled, not descheduled. Half of the folks are saying that would be great. Anything's better than Schedule 1. Quarter, not ideal, but I'd be okay with it. One individual, not so sure. And one is just straight up, this would be an outright disaster. Well, this is going to be really exciting. So let's jump in. Let me, where's my little prompt here? So welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to introduce our two guest speakers that we have today. It's really hard to do both of them justice. I've had the pleasure of getting to know both Andrew and Alena since before the pandemic. They're two passionate, respected industry leaders that I really have the utmost respect for. Andrew, if you want to come join us, Andrew serves as the trusted advisor to companies in highly regulated industries as senior counsel and the firm-wide co-chair of the Cannabis Industry Group at the Perkins Coie law firm. In this capacity, Andrew focuses on regulatory compliance, due diligence, litigation, internal investigations, and public policy development. He really does bring a rare combination of legal, public policy, regulatory enforcement, rulemaking, and prosecutorial experience to the firm. After building on his decades of service in the highest levels of government and in the private and non-profit sectors. He has an amazingly deep and celebrated background in coalition creation and management. He had about 15 years as a federal prosecutor. He's a policy advisor to then Vice President Biden and counsel to then Senator Biden, and has served in the Enforcement Bureau and the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. Represents clients in some of the most sensitive and challenging areas of law and policy. More recently, he did serve as the public policy director for the National Cannabis Industry Association, which is the place where I had the pleasure to get to actually meet and get to know Andrew, which is one of the oldest and largest trade organizations for the state legal cannabis industry. Under his leadership, he developed some really cool stuff, some amazing public policy documents to promote, grow, and protect state legal cannabis businesses. The council's work really served to inform and influence members of Congress, executive branch, state, and regulators on the future of the burgeoning industry. I'll never forget, Andrew and I share some roots going back to New England. We're both from outside of Boston originally. I'll never forget the first time I got to meet you, Andrew, at one of the NCI events in Boston, overlooking the harbor. The governor of Massachusetts had just banned all vape products, I think that earlier that day. And it was I believe maybe the next day that you would organize that historic summit with formerly incarcerated individuals from the failed war on drugs and high-profile members of law enforcement, policy members, and legislators. So it was pretty amazing going back right before the pandemic time, which is essentially forever ago. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, David.
And so now on to Alena. Alena is a consultant in the cannabis industry. She has a passion for standardization, expertise in business operations, lab testing, quality management systems, and regulatory compliance. She's got a master's degree in biomedical sciences and a bachelor's degree in biology from Florida Atlantic University. Prior to the cannabis industry, she worked in molecular biology, analytical chemistry, and neuroscience laboratories at FAU, Envoy Therapeutics, and the University of Colorado Anschutz doing drug discovery research. So wicked smart people here. I don't even know how to do both of these folks justice. It's quite a long resume. Alena is currently the chair of the lab subcommittee at ASTM International's Committee D37 on cannabis. So I've gotten to know her both there and through our NCIA work. She's also the executive member, one of the executive members of the National Cannabis Laboratory Council, which Andrew, Alena, and I will talk a bit about today as well. She's active on AOAC's CASP Microbiology Working Group, and the Scientific Advisory Committee and NCIA. Most recently, she was working at RM3 Labs, an analytical cannabis testing facility in Colorado, where she worked her way up from lead microbiologist through quality manager and then managing director. She led their efforts to get ISO 17025 accredited, amongst a host of other things. Having been involved in the state of Colorado's policy work for several years, that's when I first got to cross paths with Alena. Her policy acumen, leadership, and drive really constantly inspires me to continue to put my best foot forward every day for my clients in our industry. And I'm so excited to have both of you here today. Welcome, Alena.
Thanks.
So I don't think I could have found a better panel for today's important discussion that really affects all of us. We're in very much uncharted territory, which, while exciting, uncertainty is never good for a marketplace. So we've got a lot to cover today on discussing Biden's scheduling directive and what that really means for our industry and could mean. So let's dive in. I've got a bunch of questions here that we're going to walk through. And again, folks, feel free to throw some comments in the chat, your questions, and I'll do my best to answer them throughout. But Andrew, to start off, so I can stop talking for a minute here, can you summarize Biden's directive for us?
I sure can, although I'm looking at the list of folks who are participating here, and I sort of feel like the student who's delivering his final project to the teacher who knows a lot more, given that Dr. Ostroff is on here, Dr. Ostroff. And then just want to acknowledge Gabe Parton-Lee, who's the general counsel at Wild, whose company is manufacturing one of the best products in the industry, and they're a super socially responsible company. And of course, Elizabeth Berry, who has been working with Alena and I on lab standards. So, in terms of the Biden's directive, there's a lot more than meets the eye here. On October 6th, Biden issued a directive that did three things. First, it pardoned people with federal marijuana possession convictions. Second, the president asked governors to do the same at the state level. And then third, and most notably, he directed the Secretary of HHS and the Attorney General to initiate an administrative process to, and using his words, expeditiously review how marijuana is scheduled. He didn't define what expeditiously means in that directive, but we're interpreting that to mean that he wants it done before the end of his first term. At least that's what we're hoping. First, let me just say that, it feels to me like people are minimizing the historical significance of this action. This was the first real initiative by any sitting president on marijuana reform. The pardons were also not insignificant, though I understand that some people wanted it to include, possession with the intent to distribute or distribution. Maybe that'll come later, we don't know, but what he did was historically very significant. The second prong is already moving states to take action. We just saw last week or the week before the governor of Oregon pardoning everyone in the state of Oregon for possession. But third, and most notably, the administrative scheduling evaluation process is now underway, and that is a really big deal. And I wish that people would stop complaining and start participating in that process, because there's a lot of work to do. It would be more productive to pitch in rather than protest, in my view. But there's a process underway, and there will be an outcome. It is certain that there is going to be an outcome. The question is whether the industry is going to have the opportunity to influence that outcome. But the fact that there will be an outcome is a fact. So, from my perspective, let's do what we can to inform that process and make that process better with the best information possible, and get cannabis either descheduled, which is our North Star, or at least placed below Schedule 2. My main concern here is that if we just let FDA do their thing, that we'll see cannabis in Schedule 2, and that is not going to be a win for us for a whole variety of reasons. It will be, first of all, a lost opportunity. With Kevin McCarthy as the incoming speaker, I don't really see that we're going to have much opportunity in Congress for cannabis reform. And so it could be quite a while before we're able to shape this process. The industry has been waiting for action. So great, let's act on it. And if the industry doesn't, if the process doesn't yield what the industry wants, and we didn't inform it, then that'll be a real shame. Again, like as much as I love Nancy Mace and all she's done, I just don't really see Kevin McCarthy wanting to move cannabis reform as an issue in the House. So hopefully people will step up.
Well said, Andrew. I don't think the importance of this initiative and the time and the opportunity that we have in front of us as an industry is something that can be understated. Well, so much to unpack there. Let's kind of building off of that. What are the governmental processes? Can you briefly describe the governmental processes involved with rescheduling versus descheduling?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. There's the process itself, and then there's the difference between rescheduling and descheduling. So on the process, as probably most everyone knows, there's both a congressional process and an administrative process. The congressional process requires legislation and 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. Yesterday we saw Congress pass a historic piece of legislation with a margin of 61 votes in the Senate, but that's pretty unheard of in these political times. But it is the easiest way to legally get it done because you don't need to make determinations about abuse potential or medicinal value. But the Senate is split. We need 10 Republicans to get over a filibuster, and so as I just said, Kevin McCarthy is now the Speaker in the House. So I think the congressional piece is probably off the table for a while. We've seen some descheduling bills in the House and Senate, the MORE Act, Schumer Booker CAOA, and Nancy Mace's bill in the House. I don't believe we've seen any rescheduling bills. I could be wrong about that, but at least during my tenure in cannabis, I don't think we've seen those. But then there's this administrative process, and that's the one we're in now. It's much more cumbersome than passing a piece of legislation, and much more difficult. But it's started. And as I said, there will be an outcome, and it's our best chance of seeing reform in the near term, no question. I'll say a little bit about descheduling versus rescheduling. Of course, descheduling fully legalizes cannabis. That is our North Star. If we deschedule, cannabis would be treated like alcohol or tobacco or caffeine or sugar, and anything that's off the schedule. As far as DEA is concerned, it would be fully legal, but FDA would still enforce the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and look at marijuana in foods or beverages and any products making health claims. But there'd be no criminal penalties, and 280E would be fixed overnight. So that's what we're hoping for. I think expectations are pretty low that cannabis will be descheduled through this process, but that's what we're fighting for. As far as rescheduling is concerned, there are 5 schedules. Right now, cannabis is on Schedule 1, a classification that's based on the fiction that cannabis has a high abuse potential and has no medicinal value. There's no question that cannabis does not belong in Schedule 1. We know this because we know that cannabis has medicinal value. I mean, HHS owns the patent on the medicinal value of marijuana. We have 38 states with medicinal programs treating ailments like chronic pain. The FDA has approved multiple drugs containing some form of cannabis. So we know there are medicinal properties, and the president's drug czar, 2 or 3 weeks ago said as much. It's also true that the abuse potential for cannabis doesn't equate to the drugs that are in Schedule 1, like heroin or LSD. It just doesn't. So cannabis should come off Schedule 1. It better come off Schedule 1. That should be a certainty, in my view, but I guess we'll see. The real question is, where does it go? Rescheduling would fix 280E, but only if it's placed below Schedule 2. And so that's where the battle lines are going to be drawn. Can we get it out of Schedule 2, out of Schedule 1 and out of Schedule 2? And that's why, businesses should be engaged in this process. Rescheduling would decrease criminal penalties. The further down you go in the schedule, the lower the criminal penalties. technically, rescheduling does set requirements for DEA registration and FDA oversight as a drug, but we believe, and I'm fairly certain that Dr. Offshoff would probably agree, that FDA just doesn't have the bandwidth or resources or desire to regulate marijuana. You just have to look at CBD and Delta 8 to see that they're really largely focused on companies making health claims or selling intoxicating products that appeal to kids. So, we shall see. That was a long-winded answer. I'm happy to go into sort of the semantics of how this actually happens, but I should probably take a breath.
No, so much content there, Andrew. Yeah, and folks, as you kind of think through and process everything that we're talking about today, Andrew especially, feel free to throw any comments or questions in the chat, and we can try to dive in a little bit deeper as time permits. Otherwise, there may be good opportunities for follow-up. So we'll see where everything falls. Alena, let's give you some airtime. So, from your perspective, you've been really active in this industry, especially, just outside of RM3 labs and your work in lab testing. I mean, you're an amazing, fierce force working on the scientific advisory committee at NCIA, helping write policy in the state of Colorado, and leading task groups. Why is this a historic announcement from your lens? And can you tell me how this is important to our industry?
Well, as a professional in the industry and also a medical user, even if we drop to Schedule 2 or hopefully something below it or off the schedule altogether, that finally is the federal government admitting that there is a medical use. No longer can they say there's no medical use, because that's what Schedule 1 is. So I think that's a very big historic point of this whole directive. And I do think, while it may be slow if we get dropped to 2 to further drop from 2, I do think that if we do drop from Schedule 1 at to any level, that will open the door for more research, because we're in this catch-22 where the DEA and the FDA is constantly reevaluating, because anybody could petition the DEA to reevaluate a drug, and it's happened several times since 1970 when cannabis was put on the schedule. They keep asking the same question: does it have medical use? Does it have a high potential for abuse? And you can't really expect them to come up with a different answer if there's a federal blockade to doing such research to prove that it has medical use or a lower potential for abuse. So I think if we drop from Schedule 1, that'll open the door for research, and then hopefully that research will further, drop us down the schedule or off the schedule altogether in the future. There's also 2 other reasons why I think this is historic, is that it may affect the future of how FDA evaluates other drugs. So right now, the FDA typically, when it's evaluating whether a drug on the Schedule 1 has a medical use, whether it should be dropped, they're asking, well, is there a currently, approved, FDA approved drug on the market for this, substance? While there are some CBD related FDA approved drugs, there is not one for cannabis, in its entirety. So that's typically how they interpret that question. Well, there's no FDA approved drug, guess it doesn't have a medical use. And so I think, if a cannabis is able to drop from the schedule without being a FDA approved drug, I think that opens the door for other things like psilocybin, peyote, and other things. Also, it may affect how the FDA thinks about the prescription drug model in general. So typically it thinks about it in a one molecule type of way. A drug has one active molecule. It's not used to something like cannabis that has nearly 500 components that together work as an entourage to, produce medical value. So I think that it'll be very interesting to see the FDA rethink its, one molecule system that it's held for so many, decades.
Yeah, well said, Alena. Sorry, I don't know if I didn't cut you off, did I?
No.
Okay, yeah, and just a brief plug while we're talking here. GW Pharma has the first FDA approved drug that is derived from cannabis, being Epidiolex. And there's a global workshop next week that ASTM and the US Pharmacopoeia is putting on, where Alan, the director of cultivation over there for over 20 years, as well as several other global regulators will be speaking. And I think, there's some important points there you've touched on, Alena, and how we think about the single molecule API drug. There is some some botanical guidance for botanical drug research and development that the FDA has put out and exists. But to your point, it's a high bar. There's a lot of work and research required to get any sort of product approved. And we're talking to the tune of billions of dollars on average. I think $2.6 billion is the average cost, with about 12-year pipeline to go from concept to drug approval through the FDA's process. So there's definitely, between what you and Andrew said, there's a lot of benefits here. There's a lot of risks as well with the different scheduling and a rescheduled world. But I think we could argue until the cows come home where what if having Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 is the worst thing in the world for us as an incremental move forward. All right, that said, let's keep moving. So Andrew, unless you, I don't know if you have anything to add to Alena's comments, otherwise I'll kind of queue you up for the next question being, some believe the industry could change as we know it because of this directive, which I think you've kind of identified will happen, in that there is going to be a decision. There will be something likely by the end of Biden's current administration. But others also believe that it will retain, this scheduling change will retain most of the laws, regardless of if descheduling or rescheduling happens. What aspects of the industry are most likely to change if it's moved from Schedule 1 and effectively legalizing it? Curious for your thoughts there. That's kind of a long question, I know.
Yeah, no, and I'd be happy to answer that. I will piggyback a little bit on what Alena said in terms of why this is historic and I'm seeing two things. Number one is that Bernie Sanders was not elected president of the United States. I don't think anyone expected that Joe Biden was going to be the guy that would do this. And to me, that is just amazing. He's really solidified his progressive credentials. And, I keep saying this, I think democratic politics and cannabis reform are inextricably intertwined. If you care about these issues, you need to vote for Democrats. It just is what it is. So that's, one thing that's historic. And then the other is, I really do think this is going to be a win as long as we're out of Schedule 1 and out of Schedule 2. I really do think it's going to be a win for the industry, partially because what Alena said about research and, how FDA will view drugs, but also because it gets us out of 280E and alleviates some of those criminal penalties. So I do think that this is historic, big time. In terms of, what's likely to change, I think the thing that keeps me awake at night is if we were to deschedule, and again, I find it hard to believe that the FDA is going to do that, but if the FDA recommends that and DEA goes along with it, what happens then? What happens when we wake up the next morning? We need a plan, right? We can't just not have regulations. And, I think we've seen what's happened with hemp and CBD and frankly, Delta 8, where FDA's, I don't know, we testified before the FDA in April of, I think it was 2019, and there were still no rules. And so, we have to protect those state regulatory authorities. And the way to do that is to pause the Dormant Commerce Clause and allow states to continue to do what they're doing. States are doing a great job. Let's let them continue their good work until we establish, national standards for lab testing and packaging and labeling and age verification. Everything that will need to come next. With rescheduling, things will change for the positive, but I really would love to see, and I don't think it's likely, but I would love to see an enforcement discretion memo from the FDA, sort of like the DOJ's Cole memo, that just says, as long as you're abiding by state law, you're not making health claims, you're not appealing to children, that we're going to leave you alone. That to me would be a game changer if we're in the rescheduling realm.
Well said, Andrew. And I think, really important point there that I'll tee up into Alena's question about, so great, we've got some sort of federal legalization now and in this, future state, but now what do rules look like? What's in the Code of Federal Regulations? What's the framework by which we regulate this industry and enable interstate commerce, even whether not even getting into the, we could have a whole nother webinar, a whole day on the Dormant Commerce Clause, I'm sure as well. So we'll abstain from that and just say, folks, if you're not familiar with the Dormant Commerce Clause, Andrew's written along with a couple of other great scholars about that. Can probably share that in a follow-up email, but kind of building off your point though, Andrew, and back to like testing requirements and product safety and quality and standards. Alena, testing could be one part of the industry that could change as a result of this directive. From your eyes, what does quality control and testing look like in the pharmaceutical industry for drugs? Thinking about the Schedule 2 through 5, rescheduling framework, and building on that too. If I can ask a second question at the same time, what does it look like for consumables off the schedule, such as in the food and dietary supplement industry? So basically, what does the testing industry look like on the other side of the fence there, where we're more familiar as a consumer?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the people being scared about like the possibility of rescheduling is it suddenly puts us under the prescription drug model. Well, what does that look like? What is quality control and testing in the pharmaceutical industry? It's far more, comprehensive than what we have in cannabis right now, because, there's that federal oversight with the FDA approval. So every drug, it takes about 5 to 10 years. They have to go through basic research, preclinical trials, clinical trials, and they have to submit a report to the FDA, and the FDA comes out and inspects them pre-approval to make sure that they're making quality and safe drugs. So, we don't really have that, that pre-manufacturing inspections. We don't have that pre-market approval for most cannabis products in most states. So there's that more oversight, right? And then, as far as quality control is in pharmaceutical industry, it relies heavily on good manufacturing practices, GMP, and quality management systems, QMS, and risk-based assessments. So, GMP compliance is required in the pharmaceutical industry. It's not required in most states for cannabis. And as far as testing programs, those testing programs are developed by the drug manufacturers themselves. There's not like the FDA saying, hey, you drug manufacturer, you have to do these certain tests with these certain analytes at this frequency with this sample size. No, the drug companies have to, develop their own programs informed by their specific processes and their risks in their facility using their equipment. And then also when we talk about labs in the pharmaceutical industry, they have to follow good laboratory practices, another good standardized set of regulations, good clinical practices, and also they have to follow ICH guidance, which is the International Council for Harmonization. So in our industry, we're used to ISO 17025 accreditation for the labs. And obviously, we're used to third-party labs only. In the pharmaceutical industry, you also have the option of internal labs as well. So when we talk about things off the schedule like food, dietary supplements, and how quality control and testing is done in those industries, has a lot of similarities to pharmaceuticals, but there's no pre-approval. There's no, FDA is not inspecting every food manufacturer, every supplement manufacturer. Also, the quality control is very similar because they do have their own set of GMP. It might be a little less stringent than pharmaceuticals, but still they're required to follow GMP. And the testing programs, again, like pharmaceuticals, they are designed by the food manufacturers, the supplement manufacturers, informed by their processes and risks. I would say a big difference between lab testing and lab accreditation in pharmaceutical versus cannabis and food. Actually, in food and supplements, they aren't required to follow GLP. They aren't required to be ISO 17025 accredited. So, so we do have that, those differences between the industries. So, there are people, afraid that we're going to have to follow those pharmaceutical drug model quality control and GMP style for drugs. I just again, like Andrew, I just don't see the FDA being like, yeah, we have tons of time to review all these applications for all these different cannabis products, and we have the time to go in there and inspect them for approval like they do for all the other drugs on Schedule 2 through 5.
Yeah. Well said. And I think one of the biggest takeaways, it's a pain point that I always see, is when I talk to clients as well, I'm like, I'm sorry, the state regulations have set a lot of our industry up for failure with this concept of just do the final product testing. All right, Andrew, Alena, let's go hang out, make some whatever novel product, derived from the cannabis plant. Let's put CBD in a sock. I don't know, like Alena, you've seen some of the craziest things that I never even thought imaginable, with this innovation. And when we say just test for these analytes, a very rigid requirement, we're missing, innovation in what raw ingredients, excipients, diluents, et cetera, that we may be adding into those products. And if we're not asking folks to test for it, then we're never going to know whether they're there in safe amounts, safe concentrations, et cetera. And that's really where the whole GMP process, and Alena, where you were saying, you actually tell the lab what to test for, right? Like you do a risk assessment, you look at your raw materials and you evaluate, and you also test throughout the process. You don't just wait until the end and say, all right, I ran blind for 8 weeks growing this plant, let's hope it passes. It's no, I'm building in stage gates to build quality into our process and into our product, so that I know when I say test for these things, I'm verifying that if I'm using toluene or whatever solvent you're using, or reactions may happen, you're verifying that that chemical compound is not there, or if it's there, is in a certain level that's acceptable, and you've defined that criteria versus this fixed mindset. So it's overall, major boom for product safety and consumer safety, but it is going to be some growing pains in terms of shifting the mindset and the culture of how we set up our frameworks in the States. All right, with that said, that was my little soapbox here for a second. Andrew, Alena and I kind of just talked about that, quality control process, final product testing for federally legal drugs. Some think that, you talked a little bit about the prescription drug model. So if we go into rescheduling, then we're talking prescription drugs, which, as Alena was mentioning too, about the whole feasibility of the FDA approval process being, a prerequisite. Are you hearing anything in your circles about that and the feasibility and impacts?
Yeah, I mean, technically it's absolutely true that we would be in a prescription drug model. I think some people would say we're in a prescription drug model now. Alena and I have talked about this and sort of disagree, but we agree with each other that we're not, but we would be if we reschedule. But, and that technically would mean, GMPs, clinical trials, lots of money to bring a product to market in interstate commerce. And of course, if we reschedule, there would still be criminal penalties for what anyone might consider to be trafficking, which is not following that model. But the reality is, as Alena was saying, something quite different. The FDA regulates food, drugs, and cosmetics, and marijuana, especially smokable marijuana, doesn't fit neatly into any of those categories. And the FDA just does not have the desire or the manpower or the money to enforce against a new regulatory regime that doesn't really exist. So, I agree that in reality, we would still be in the same place, meaning we would still be in this murky place with some uncertainty. And that to me, is not an ideal situation, right? I mean, the best situation would be to deschedule, so there's clarity. And that's why I was saying earlier that we want this enforcement discretion memo if we can get it, because if we don't, we're left in this constant limbo where the federal law says one thing, yet agencies at the federal level are refraining from enforcement, but they're not necessarily saying we won't in perpetuity. And that is not going to convince banks. It's not going to convince insurance companies. It's not going to convince payment processors or capital markets to fully lean in, because there will still be that uncertainty. And so, I will continue to pound the pavement on the fact that we need to, as an industry, and any ancillary companies, by the way, that are interested in or care about this issue, lean into descheduling really hard and see what we can do.
Yeah, well said. And that's something that thank you for reminding me that has really been something I've gravitated toward and appreciated your perspective on, Andrew, since I first got to speak with you and hear you, is that we need to all be rowing in the same direction as an industry and supporting a unified message. And to the extent that we continue to not do that, we're only shooting ourselves in the foot. We're going to have this quagmire of, say, a rescheduled product, drug that is cannabis, and do we have a discretion enforcement memo? Like all these little things, like this is what we need to align around so that we can move the industry forward to reduce the uncertainty, because the marketplace is just going to continue to be in limbo, and that's not good for any of us from a financial, economic viability and product quality and safety. And I just want to take a note here. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Oster. Just a couple of comments here that have come in the chat regarding the reality. We won't even be able to get into the 8-factor analysis, but the chances being pretty slim. I think we're in agreement there that the FDA would be able to recommend descheduling, because that would require a conclusion that there is no abuse potential, right? And think about the burden of evidence to say there's no abuse potential. I don't think any product I can think about, I don't know, well, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but there's an LD50 for water, but is there an abuse potential there? No, probably not, right? But there's a abuse potential for a lot of products in the marketplace. So I think that's a high bar for us to work at. And then, the DEA doesn't have to follow the FDA's scheduling recommendation either. So there's some, devil in the details there that I know we won't be able to fully unpack, but I hope folks that are listening both now and on the future webinar, recording, be able to just wrap their heads around the reality that this is a complex process and we need to really understand it, and so that we can advocate for the right messaging and with sound data and sound science. Let me bring it back to Alena there. Do you have anything to add at this to kind of what we talked about there? I'll just bring it back to you for a second before we start talking a bit more about the NCLC. Any take here?
Yeah, so I guess we should focus on the more reasonable approach would be rescheduling, right? And so I do think people should keep in mind, if we're rescheduled, I don't think it's realistic to believe the FDA will just let the states do what they want to do, like they're currently doing right now. I think if it's rescheduled, they are, effectively federally legalizing it. There may be, prescriptions involved, things like that. But I think that it's safe to assume that quality control, things like quality control and testing, packaging, labeling, age verification, those things will need to be harmonized. I don't think that the feds are going to be okay with like one state testing for 13 pesticides, the other state testing for 104, or or some states using GMP and others not. I think that they're used to having consumers trust the products that the FDA allows because they follow standards, because they have GMP, and because they do proper testing throughout the process and not just at the final end product.
Yeah, and two quick things as we pivot to NCLC. One being that I've heard a few folks say this, and I completely agree that in many regards, the FDA has actually done such a stand-up job at regulating our products generally, like food, dietary supplements, pharmaceuticals, that consumers have this false perception that I walk into a 7-Eleven gas station and pick up my 1,000 milligrams of Delta 8, or I go to a medical or adult use cannabis dispensary, and those products have been overseen. There's rigorous quality control measures in place, and that they're safe, and that why should I think anything otherwise when the reality could not be as far from that truth in our space, especially in the intoxicating synthetic, minor, novel cannabinoid products, whatever you want to call them. So it's a real challenge with consumers not even being aware of the lack of oversight that we currently have in our marketplaces, especially surrounding building and quality practices like GMPs. So really important things to just for all of us to keep in mind as we walk and interact with members and colleagues and patients every day. Kind of building on the quality side and the minimum testing, because I guess the other point I was going to make is, and getting to know some of the folks at CANRO, the Cannabis Regulators Association, and talking to multiple regulators, they're looking at this problem as well, right? They're, Andrew, you touched on state marketplaces and, different, lack of harmonization and how, federal versus state and interactions will happen in a descheduled or rescheduled world. And they're trying to figure out, what are the basic requirements that we need to align on? You talked about packaging and labeling and testing. Those are critical things to be able to go from Colorado to New Mexico or Massachusetts to California or anything in between. We have to have some sort of harmonized best practice. I like to say, imagine you've got the railroad that's a 23-inch gauge, width, and then you hit the next state and it's at 21 inches. That just doesn't work. How do we take everything off the train? retest it and go through that, talk about more barriers to entry. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us, which I think is the importance of us growing together. Now, all that said, Andrew, the NCLC, the National Cannabis Laboratory Council, which I know Alena is one of the top leaders here, along with Elizabeth, who so great to see her on the call as well. With that group, you recently issued a white paper. What the heck is the NCLC? Like, tell us about that group, why you stood it up. I think we all know you're just a Rockstar Coalition former. Yeah, tell us a little bit about the NCLC.
Yeah, will do. Let me just respond to Dr. Ostroff's comment, because he's spot on. And what we're doing, we formed a coalition to try to influence the FDA on this issue. And what we're doing is we're asking the FDA to interpret their definition differently for cannabis. I know it's sort of very lawyerly and kind of a stretch. The definition of abuse potential is not statutory. It's a definition that FDA has taken from legislative history. And so, we're asking them to look at cannabis in a different way. I agree 100% that it's highly unlikely, 99.999% chance that they're not going to do that. But that's where we're trying to press, is on the abuse potential piece, is to have them look at cannabis differently than they would other drugs that clearly have major abuse potential, particularly in larger doses. In terms of the NCLC, as you said, Alena and Elizabeth know the substance here a lot better than I do. They are complete rock stars. I formed the coalition because interstate commerce is coming. It may not be today, clearly, it may not be tomorrow, clearly, but it is coming. And in order for that to happen seamlessly, and if we're going to preserve state laws in some regard, we need to make sure that there are no state laws in place that might impede interstate commerce. And so, as we look at things like lab testing, and we see that states have different requirements from state to state, it became readily apparent that lab testing was one of the pieces that we needed to fix ahead of legalization, so that when legalization happens, interstate commerce can happen seamlessly. It's not the only issue. As I said, packaging and labeling, track and trace, there are other issues that we're going to need to sort out. But we can't, wait until legalization happens and then think, oh, we're going to harmonize lab testing throughout the country. So that's why we're doing the work now. We think we developed a really good white paper that set us on a good path to get ahead of the inevitable, and to develop a unified approach to lab testing. The work continues. The coalition continues to expand. I'm sure Alena has a lot more to say about the substance, but I think it's really important work, and I'm just grateful to be working with Alena again and Elizabeth for the first time, because they really know their shit.
Well said, Andrew. Yeah, Alena, dive in on the technical side and tell us a bit more about NCLC's recommendations. I know you have some great plugs. I was grateful to get to review that with you folks before it was published. You did a really amazing job at highlighting some of the standards that exist and, best practice limitations. You guys put in so much work to evaluate the state marketplaces and the discrepancies we've really touched on. So, my question being, right, how could NCLC's recommendations be used by federal agencies in light of, Biden's scheduling directive?
So I think, the scheduling directive could, put us on reschedule or deschedule, which is unlikely, but possibly reschedule, which means that, we're going to have, come together and have a harmonized framework. We can't have this, one size fits all different testing regimen per state, like Andrew said, because it'll impede interstate commerce. So I think our recommendations really provide a transitional plan to getting from where we are today, those state variable programs, to where we want to be, which is GMP and risk-based programs where manufacturers are developing those testing regimens for themselves. So our recommendations, I believe, can provide a transitional framework, a baseline of, okay, here's the things that we should be testing for. And we didn't just copy and paste, one state's list because we like that state's list better than the others. We actually got a lot of labs together. The labs that we got together covered over a dozen states. And we looked at our data and we said, okay, well, there are 25 states that are asking us to test for this contaminant. Have any of you ever seen that in cannabis? No. Well, it's like a mini risk assessment. Maybe we shouldn't be focusing on testing for that contaminant then. And on the flip side, there's a bunch of contaminants and byproducts from different processing techniques that that we're not looking for. And that's because we just simply are following copy and pasted lists from other industries that may not have those same byproducts or the same contaminants that we do in our industry. So I think, it could, help transition us from where we are today to, hopefully a more GMP style program.
Well said, Alena. Just to pause for a second, a few things in the chat as well. So the NCLC white paper, threw a link in there. So if you haven't heard about it somehow or haven't read it yet, take a link there. Quick plug to Americans for Safe Access and some of the work that they've done, especially historically. Thanks, Debbie, for sharing that. And then I'll actually throw one more link in there just because what more resources could you have? Another really great complementary paper actually came out of the FDA. It was, I believe, one of the interns at the time that was working on this initiative. There's a great paper, Quality Standards in State Programs Permitting Cannabis for Medical Uses, where they actually evaluated essentially what Alena just described that they also did, NCLC did, which formed the comprehensive white paper. This is a great FDA evaluation. So we know they're looking at it. We know they're trying to figure out and give, guidance in I'll call it cryptic ways, for lack of a better term. There are some really smart, driven scientists within the FDA that are rock stars and can do a lot of work, but we've just got a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of moving parts that Andrew has really, touched the surface on in the last kind of 40 minutes, 50 minutes or so. So with that said, I think we've got a good idea of, one of the questions I was going to ask is, what approach, rescheduling or descheduling, do you think the industry should be advocating for and why? I think you've already kind of alluded to it, but maybe it's more of a recap question. So, yeah, just briefly, Andrew, which one and why, if you haven't already made it clear enough?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I think I've said it, right? I think we have to advocate for descheduling for a few reasons, politically, and because it's the best solution for the industry. But we also have to be realistic that we're, 99.999% sure we're not going to get it. And so the real fight is going to be get us out of Schedule 1 and 2. And from my perspective, if we're in Schedule 3 or below, it will be an incremental win. It won't be exactly what we want or what we need, but it will be, it will be a win.
Yeah, I like it. And I like to think about it as like and I think you mentioned this or alluded to this, you or Alena earlier, like the North Star. If we get our sight on descheduling, we know that's not where we're going to be tomorrow or even next year. But if we don't set our sights there and push in that direction, we're not going to even be able to get, comprehensive rescheduling that is, science-based, science-driven, and allows us to open the doors for more data, more research. Well said, Andrew. Alena, do you have anything to add or contradict to that point?
No, I'm definitely camp descheduling, obviously, but I think everybody should just be advocating for any schedule change. Also, know your audience when you're advocating. So if you are pushing descheduling on somebody who still calls it the devil's lettuce and believes in reefer madness, you're probably going to push that person more in the prohibition corner. So that person, you should definitely be saying, Schedule 3 or 4 or 5, right? If you're talking to somebody who has their ears open, push descheduling, because that's just putting more people on our side, hopefully, after maybe an incremental push to dropping down the schedule to maybe getting off of it altogether after we have more research.
Well said. One thing it reminds me of one of the best fun facts I learned this past month. I was down in the state of Mississippi talking to regulators, Department of Health, and legislators. And when I was sitting at dinner with one of them, they told me when medical cannabis passed in the state of Mississippi, out of it was either 1,170 or 1,700 precincts, somebody can fact check me on that, but only 9 precincts did not approve medical cannabis. just think about that. The tides are shifting. And I think that just, Alena, you're talking about know your audience, just reminded me of that. We really have to understand our audience, think about the compassion, the medical aspects, and, the data-driven aspects to open access, address the war on drugs, et cetera. So really, really well said point there. And, again, we've made a lot of progress. It is 2022, so a long ways to go, but this is historic, right? Andrew, what advice, kind of wrapping up here, and I think it's been a great discussion. We've got about 5 minutes left, so just a couple of final questions. What advice would you give cannabis businesses to prepare them for federal legalization, recognizing that this is a journey, not a destination we're going to just pass through a stage gate and one day and wake up and life is different, right?
So, David, we had a call. But you and I did not go over our answers. And so for those listening, David does not know what I'm about to say, nor did he ask me to say it, but you can buy me a beer at any point. Kidding. But, from my perspective, the obvious answer is to get GMP certified now, because the FDA is coming in one way or another. And waiting for legalization feels like a really bad idea to me, because there's going to be a scramble at the end. And if you're, waiting in line to hire someone to help you get GMP certified, when everyone else is, and when FDA is requiring it, you're going to have a long delay. And so, that to me, that is the most obvious answer to that question. I'd be curious to hear what Alena has to say, but I would say, start anticipating the FDA's jurisdiction and think about what you can do to get yourself ready.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree. Implement GMP, have a third party come in and review to make sure that you're doing the right thing, because none of us, really have done it for cannabis much, right? It's still pretty new. But also I would say, join trade groups and standard developing organizations like NCLC, ASTM, AOAC. I mean, you know what they say, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're what's on the menu. So, the Code of Federal Regulations references over 2,000 ASTM standards for other industries. So it's likely that they're also going to reference ASTM standards or similar organization standards for cannabis. So if you want to, be involved in developing those standards that you will probably have to follow in the future, I suggest joining those groups. And then another thing is sharing data. I know that a lot of us, tend to think like, oh, my data, it's all proprietary. Well, no other industry would exist today or be as successful as they are today if they didn't share data. And so I think we can't have any testing panels or action levels for contaminants until we have consumption data and toxicology, safety, quality testing data from cannabis specific products, not just pulling that stuff from other products from other industries.
Well said, Alena. I think just to add to a couple of those points and recap as we wrap up here. So, and folks that are here today, we're not on last month. God, it seems so long ago. Last month's episode where Darwin and I talked about standards. We essentially spent the whole hour nerding out on just what Alena discussed there, the tip of the iceberg, with ASTM standards, incorporation by reference into the Code of Federal Regulations. Organizations like AOAC International developing standards as well. They have a long-standing history of reference for pretty much all food products and how they're tested. Their AOAC's methods of analyses, U.S. Pharmacopoeia. We have some amazing resources out there. There's 9 states. I believe it's 9 states. Maybe it's 13. Might be getting my numbers mixed up. Alena, you helped me with that most recently, that already have GMPs referenced into their state regulations. So this is not a foreign concept. Andrew, I appreciate the plug, but it's like, don't just take your or my word for it. Look at the writing on the wall and then look globally, right? This is not a foreign concept. This is how the industry works globally. So to think that we won't have some flavor of GMPs is kind of crazy to think about. So well said. I look forward to buying both of you beers when we get together next and talk about how we really help the industry together continually. This has been fantastic. We're right at time here. So this has been a well-timed and well put together hour. I really appreciate having both of you on the at the table today. Thank you for spending your evening with us, everybody. I don't know if you have any last words, Alena and Andrew. Otherwise, I think we're here to wrap up, and just put a reminder, sorry, before I do that, thank you, Emmy, for putting a few things in there. I'll link to the YouTube channel where all of our previous episodes exist. We also have the webinar happening December 14th on sustainability and data, which is super key. GMPs are actually data-driven decision-making processes. So there's a lot more alignment than folks may realize, and less to fear about GMPs. But without further ado, for my soapbox, any final words, Andrew, Alena, before we close out?
GMP.
I love it. Andrew, anything else to add, or you said it well?
No, I don't think so. Thanks to everyone for joining.
Yeah, this is great. Until next time, everybody, enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much again, Andrew and Alena. I look forward to seeing you all soon. Cheers.
Take care. Bye-bye.